You need to evacuate immediately. The ceiling will collapse within the hour. Walter Green, 67 years old, the black janitor who had served Westbrook Academy for 30 years, stood before Principal Harrison with a yellowed blueprint trembling in his weathered hands. Behind Harrison, through the glass windows, 800 guests were streaming into the hall for the graduation ceremony, including the governor and Walter's own daughter, who had no idea he existed. Harrison smirked. "Mr. Green, you clean toilets, not design buildings. We have an inspection report from 6 months ago." Walter looked at the blueprint, his own signature from 1984, the original design that had been stolen and gutted, and knew that in 60 minutes, either he would convince them or 800 people would die beneath the very structure he had created. Westbrook Academy was not merely a school, it was a statement. Founded in 1892 by Boston's wealthiest families, it occupied 47 acres of prime real estate in the most exclusive suburb of the city, its Gothic architecture and ivy-covered walls serving as a monument to old money and older privilege. The tuition was $60,000 per year, and that bought more than education. It bought access, connections, the unspoken promise that graduates would move through the world with doors already open. The waiting list stretched for years. Parents began applying when their children were still in utero. To attend Westbrook was to be marked as exceptional, chosen, destined for greatness. The graduation ceremony was the crown jewel of the academic year, a carefully choreographed display of wealth and achievement that attracted senators, CEOs, and occasionally even foreign dignitaries. This year's ceremony was particularly significant. The governor of Massachusetts would be delivering the keynote address, and the valedictorian, a young woman named Maya Richardson, had already been accepted to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton simultaneously. 800 guests in designer clothing would fill the historic Harrison Hall, named after the family that had donated the funds for its construction 40 years ago. Security was tight. The catering was exquisite. Everything was perfect. Except that Walter Green knew the building was about to kill everyone inside it. He had known something was wrong for months, small signs that only someone who had spent 3 decades learning every inch of this structure would notice. A hairline crack in the east wall that grew a millimeter wider each week. A subtle vibration in the floor near the main support column that hadn't been there before. The way certain doors had begun to stick, as if the frames were shifting under invisible pressure. Walter had reported each observation to the maintenance supervisor, who had smiled politely and done nothing. He had mentioned his concerns to the assistant principal, who had assured him that the professionals had everything under control. He had even written a formal letter to the Board of Trustees, which had been returned unopened with a form note thanking him for his dedication to the Westbrook community. But last night, everything changed. Walter had stayed late to prepare the hall for the ceremony, setting up chairs, polishing the stage, making sure every detail was perfect for the students who would walk across that platform tomorrow and receive the diplomas that marked the end of their childhood. The building was empty, silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the soft shuffle of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. And then he heard it, a sound like a whisper, like a groan, like metal screaming in a frequency just below human hearing. Walter had frozen, his mop suspended in mid-stroke, every nerve in his body suddenly alert. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, 40 years ago, on a construction site in Detroit where a parking garage had collapsed and killed 17 workers. It was the sound of steel reaching its breaking point, the sound of a structure beginning to die. He had climbed into the maintenance crawl space above the ceiling, a journey he made regularly to check on pipes and electrical systems, though no one had ever asked him to. What he found there made his blood run cold. The main support beams, the steel skeleton that held the entire hall together, were covered in fractures, not small cracks, deep fissures that ran through the metal like veins, spreading outward from stress points that should never have existed. Someone had modified the original design. Someone had replaced the heavy-gauge steel specified in Walter's blueprints with cheaper, lighter materials that couldn't handle the load. And after 40 years of graduations and assemblies and concerts and dances, the building had finally reached its limit. Walter had spent the rest of the night calculating. He had pulled out the original blueprints, the ones he had kept hidden in his locker for 30 years, the ones no one knew he possessed, and compared them to what he had seen in the crawl space. The math was simple and terrifying. At the current rate of deterioration, with the additional weight of 800 people packed into the hall, the ceiling would collapse within hours of the ceremony's start. Maybe sooner, if someone slammed a door too hard or the air conditioning system created the wrong kind of vibration. Maybe later, if they were lucky. But it would collapse. That was certain. The only question was how many people would be underneath it when it did. Principal David Harrison was the third generation of his family to lead Westbrook Academy. His grandfather, Theodore Harrison Sr., had been the visionary who transformed the school from a regional institution into a national powerhouse. His father, Theodore Jr., had expanded the endowment and built the connections that made Westbrook a pipeline to the Ivy League. And David himself had spent the past 15 years maintaining the family legacy, navigating the complex politics of wealth and privilege that defined the school's culture. He was 54 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and absolutely certain that he understood how the world worked. The world worked through power, through connections, through the careful management of reputation and perception. It did not work through the warnings of elderly black janitors who claimed to hear buildings crying. "Mr. Green," Harrison said, rising from his desk with the measured patience of a man who had dealt with difficult employees before, "I understand that you've been with us for a long time. 30 years is a significant tenure, and I want you to know that your service is appreciated." He moved around the desk, positioning himself between Walter and the door, a subtle gesture of authority that was meant to end the conversation. "But you have to understand, we can't cancel a graduation ceremony attended by the governor of Massachusetts because a custodian had a bad feeling. The liability alone would be catastrophic. The damage to our reputation would be irreparable. And frankly," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "frankly, it would be irresponsible of me to act on the advice of someone who, with all due respect, lacks the technical expertise to make this kind of assessment." Walter didn't move. He had expected this response, had known, even as he walked toward Harrison's office, that his warning would be dismissed. That was how it had always been, for his entire life. The black man's voice, ignored. The black man's expertise, questioned. The black man's very existence, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be heard. But he had also spent 30 years preparing for this moment, and he was not going to let 800 people die because a white man in a suit couldn't imagine that a janitor might know something he didn't. "Mr. Harrison," Walter said quietly, "I need you to look at this blueprint." He held up the yellowed paper, its edges worn soft from decades of handling, its lines still precise despite the passage of time. "This is the original structural design for Harrison Hall. It was created in 1984, and it specifies a particular type of steel beam for the main support system. Heavy gauge, load-bearing, capable of supporting the weight of the ceiling plus a significant safety margin." He pointed to a series of notations in the corner of the blueprint. These specifications were changed before construction began. Someone substituted lighter materials, cheaper materials, materials that were never designed to bear this kind of load for this length of time. I don't know why, and right now I don't care. What I care about is that the building you're about to fill with 800 people is structurally compromised and will collapse if we don't evacuate immediately. Harrison's expression flickered, just for a moment, just enough for Walter to notice. There was something there, beneath the polished exterior. Not surprise at the information, something else, recognition, fear. And then the mask slid back into place, and Harrison was smiling again, reaching for the phone on his desk. "I think it's time we called security, mister. Green, you've clearly been under a lot of stress, and I'm concerned about your well-being. Perhaps you should take the rest of the day off, the rest of the week even, with pay, of course." Walter felt the familiar burn of rage in his chest. The rage he had learned to suppress decades ago, when expressing it could cost a black man his job, his freedom, his life. "You're not listening. People are going to die. Your students are going to die. The governor is going to die. And you're worried about liability?" Harrison's finger hovered over the phone. "I'm worried about a disturbed employee making wild accusations based on a 40-year-old piece of paper that could have come from anywhere. I'm worried about a man who has apparently been obsessing over this building's construction for 3 decades, which is frankly concerning behavior. And I'm worried about what will happen if I let a janitor's paranoid fantasies disrupt the most important event of our academic year." He pressed a button on the phone. "Security? This is Principal Harrison. I need someone to escort Mr. Green from the building. Yes, immediately. And please make sure he doesn't have access to any of the ceremony spaces." Walter looked at the man behind the desk. This third-generation guardian of privilege, this inheritor of a legacy built on stolen credit and cut corners, and made a decision. He would not go quietly. He would not let this building become a tomb. And if he had to burn down everything he had spent 30 years hiding to save the people inside it, then that was exactly what he would do. He turned and walked out of the office before security could arrive, moving with purpose through the hallways he knew better than anyone alive. He had 51 minutes before the ceremony began. 51 minutes to find someone who would listen. 51 minutes to stop a catastrophe that had been 40 years in the making. The next hour was a masterclass in institutional dismissal. Walter went to the assistant principal, who referred him back to Principal Harrison. He went to the head of facilities, who laughed and told him to stick to mopping. He went to the security chief, who threatened to have him arrested for trespassing if he didn't leave the premises. He called the fire department, who said they couldn't respond to unverified structural concerns without an official request from the building's owner. He called the police, who took his information and promised to look into it after the holiday weekend. He called the local news station, who said they'd send someone out if anything actually happens. Every door closed, every phone hung up, every face turned away. Walter stood in the parking lot with 43 minutes remaining, watching the guests stream into Harrison Hall in their designer suits and silk dresses, and felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on his shoulders. 40 years ago, he had been Walter Green, one of the most promising young architects in Boston. He had graduated top of his class from MIT, had won competitions, had been featured in architectural magazines as a rising star who would reshape the city's skyline. His designs were innovative, elegant, structurally brilliant, and they were being systematically stolen by his white partner, Theodore Harrison Sr., who had the connections and the complexion to sell them as his own. The Harrison Hall project had been Walter's masterpiece. He had spent 2 years perfecting the design, calculating load distributions, specifying materials that would ensure the building stood for centuries. And then Theodore had betrayed him. He had taken Walter's blueprints to the Westbrook board, presented them as his own work, and when Walter protested, Theodore had accused him of plagiarism. It was Walter's word against Theodore's, a young black architect against an established white developer with powerful friends. The outcome was never in doubt. Walter lost his license. He lost his reputation. He lost everything he had spent his life building. And Theodore Harrison Sr. became a celebrated philanthropist, his name immortalized on the building he had stolen. Walter had taken the janitor's job 3 years later, when he was broke and desperate, and the only positions available to a disgraced black architect were positions that didn't require references. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find a way to clear his name, that justice would eventually prevail. But years passed, then decades, and Walter found himself trapped in a strange purgatory, mopping the floors of his own creation, watching Theodore's son and then Theodore's grandson take credit for his vision, unable to prove the truth and unwilling to walk away. Because walking away would mean abandoning the building, and Walter knew even then that Theodore had cut corners. He had seen the construction crew replacing his specified materials with cheaper alternatives. He had watched the load-bearing calculations being ignored. He had known from the very beginning that Harrison Hall was a time bomb waiting to explode. So he had stayed. For 30 years, he had stayed. He had used his engineering knowledge to identify weak points in the structure. He had spent his own money, his meager janitor's salary, saved penny by penny, on materials to reinforce the most critical sections. He had worked nights and weekends, welding additional supports, replacing failing bolts, patching cracks before they could spread. No one knew. No one asked. He was just the janitor, invisible, beneath notice, exactly where he needed to be to keep the building alive. Until 2 weeks ago, when the new facilities manager had discovered Walter's unauthorized modifications during a routine inspection. The supports Walter had added were not in the original plans. They were unapproved alterations that violated building codes and insurance requirements. They had to be removed immediately to restore the structure to its intended specifications. Walter had tried to explain. He had begged. He had warned. But the facilities manager didn't listen to janitors, and the work crews had spent the past week systematically dismantling every reinforcement Walter had built over 3 decades. They thought they were fixing the building. They were actually signing its death warrant. 37 minutes. Walter stood in the shadow of an oak tree, watching the last guests disappear into the hall, and felt something break inside him. He had spent his entire life trying to work within the system, trying to be patient, trying to believe that eventually someone would listen. And here he was, 67 years old, with 37 minutes until catastrophe, and no one would give him the time of day. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as designed. It was designed to protect people like Harrison and ignore people like Walter. It was designed to value credentials over knowledge, connections over expertise, white voices over black ones. And right now, that design was about to kill 800 people, including his daughter. Walter's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph he kept as his wallpaper. Maya Richardson, 18 years old, valedictorian of the class of 2024, about to deliver the graduation speech that would launch her into a future full of promise. She had her mother's smile and her father's eyes, though she didn't know it. She had his stubborn determination and his gift for seeing patterns others missed, though she had never been told where those traits came from. She was everything Walter had ever dreamed of, everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had lived for during the long years of mopping floors and hiding in plain sight. She didn't know he existed. Maya had been born in 1986, 2 years after the Harrison Hall theft destroyed Walter's career. Her mother, Angela, had been Walter's girlfriend through architecture school, a brilliant woman who had loved him despite everything, who had stood by him through the trial and the disgrace, who had tried to help him rebuild. But Walter had pushed her away. He couldn't bear to drag her down with him, couldn't stand the thought of her sacrificing her own promising career to support a man with no future. He had told her to leave. He had convinced her he didn't want the baby. He had said terrible things, unforgivable things, things designed to make her hate him enough to walk away and never look back. Angela had believed him. She had moved across the country, started a new life, and when complications during pregnancy made it clear she couldn't care for a child alone, she had arranged for Maya to be adopted by a wealthy white family in Boston. The Richardsons were kind people who gave Maya every advantage. Private schools, music lessons, summers in Europe, the best that money could buy. They loved her as their own, and they never knew that her biological father was mopping floors 3 miles away, watching her grow up from a distance, never daring to approach. Walter had discovered Maya's existence by accident 5 years into his janitor tenure at Westbrook. He had been cleaning the administrative offices late one night when he found an enrollment file left open on a desk. Maya Richardson, incoming kindergarten student. The photograph clipped to the file showed a little girl with Angela's smile and Walter's eyes, and something in Walter's chest had shattered and reformed simultaneously. He had spent the next hour in the bathroom, crying so hard he could barely breathe. His daughter, his little girl, here, at Westbrook, 3 floors below where he worked. And she had no idea who he was. He could have revealed himself, could have fought for custody, demanded a relationship, inserted himself into her life. But what did he have to offer? A disgraced architect working as a janitor, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with a reputation so destroyed that any association with him would harm her future. The Richardsons could give her everything Walter couldn't: stability, resources, opportunities, a name that didn't carry the weight of scandal. So Walter made the hardest decision of his life. He stayed silent. He stayed invisible. He stayed close enough to watch her grow up, close enough to be there if she ever needed him, but far enough away that his failure could never touch her. 13 years. He had watched her for 13 years. Watched her win spelling bees and science fairs. Watched her join the debate team and become captain. Watched her struggle through her first heartbreak and emerge stronger. Watched her develop into a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and compassion, someone who went out of her way to be kind to the staff that other students ignored, who always said, "Good morning, Mr. Green," when she passed him in the hallway, who had no idea that those 2 words were the highlight of his entire day. And in 34 minutes, she would walk onto a stage that was going to collapse and kill her. Walter put his phone away and started walking toward the building. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have hope. He had only the absolute certainty that he was not going to stand outside and watch his daughter die. Security had been ordered to keep him out, but Walter had spent 30 years learning every entrance, every passage, every forgotten door and hidden corridor in this building. He knew ways in that didn't appear on any map, and he was going to use them. The ceremony began at exactly 2 p.m., as it had every year for the past century. The Boston Symphony Chamber players performed Pomp and Circumstance as the graduates processed down the center aisle, their faces shining with excitement and relief. Parents dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Grandparents clutched programs like treasures. The governor of Massachusetts sat in the front row next to Principal Harrison, both men wearing the expressions of people who knew they were being photographed and wanted to look appropriately dignified. No one noticed the old black janitor slipping through a service entrance near the back of the hall. No one saw him press his hand against the wall and feel the vibration that shouldn't be there. No one observed him looking up at the ceiling with the eyes of a man who had designed every beam and joint and connection, counting the seconds until disaster. 23 minutes. That was Walter's calculation. The additional weight of 800 people, the vibration of the music, the stress on already failing supports, 23 minutes until the first beam gave way, triggering a cascade that would bring the entire ceiling down on everyone below. He could save most of them if he acted now, if he ran to the front of the hall and started screaming about evacuation. Some would listen, some would run, but some would hesitate, would wait for official confirmation, would be too slow to react. And Maya was going to be on that stage in 15 minutes, standing at the podium, directly beneath the weakest point of the ceiling. He had to get her out first, had to reach her before she took that stage, had to find a way to make her listen when no one else would. Walter moved along the perimeter of the hall, staying in the shadows, avoiding the security guards who had been ordered to watch for him. He knew their patrol patterns, had observed them for years, had noted their habits and blind spots, had filed away the information without knowing why. Now he understood. Everything in his life had been leading to this moment. Every sacrifice, every humiliation, every lonely year of watching from the margins, it had all been preparation for the 53 minutes that would determine whether his daughter lived or died. The graduates were settling into their seats now, the music fading, the ceremony beginning in earnest. Principal Harrison rose to deliver his opening remarks, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced authority. Distinguished guests, proud families, and most importantly, our exceptional class of 2024, welcome to Westbrook Academy's 132nd graduation ceremony. Polite applause rippled through the audience. Today, we celebrate not just academic achievement, but the formation of character, the building of foundations that will support these young men and women throughout their lives. Walter almost laughed at the irony, building foundations. If Harrison only knew how literal that phrase was about to become. He reached the backstage area, where the graduates were lined up in alphabetical order, waiting for their names to be called. Maya Richardson was near the end of the line, her valedictorian medal gleaming against her graduation gown, her speech notes clutched in her hands. She was reviewing her opening paragraph, lips moving silently, completely focused on the words she had spent weeks perfecting. She looked exactly like her mother had looked before every important presentation, nervous but determined, afraid but refusing to let fear win. Maya. Walter spoke her name before he could stop himself, before he could think about consequences or explanations or the decades of silence he was about to shatter. She looked up, confusion flickering across her face. "Mr. Green, what are you doing back here? Is something wrong?" Everything. Everything was wrong. Walter had 18 minutes, and he was standing in front of his daughter for the first time in her life, and he had no idea how to tell her the truth without sounding insane. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent but controlled. "The building isn't safe. The ceiling is going to collapse. You need to get out now, and you need to take as many people with you as you can." Maya's expression shifted from confusion to concern, not fear of the building, but concern for him. "Mr. Green, are you okay? You're shaking. Did you hit your head or something? Maybe you should sit down." "I'm not confused. I'm not injured. I'm telling you the truth." Walter pulled out the blueprint, unfolding it with trembling hands. "This is the original structural design for this hall. I know it's real because I drew it. 40 years ago, before you were born, I was an architect. I designed this building, and then someone stole my work and changed the specifications, and now the ceiling is about to fall and everyone inside is going to die." Maya stared at him, her face cycling through disbelief, skepticism, and something that might have been the beginning of belief. You designed this building? But you're—" She stopped herself, but Walter knew what she had been about to say. "But you're a janitor. But you're old. But you're black. That doesn't make sense. Principal Harrison's grandfather designed this building. It's named after him. Theodore Harrison stole my design and destroyed my career. He accused me of plagiarism, used his connections to get my license revoked, and I've spent the last 30 years working as a janitor in my own building because it was the only way I could keep it from falling apart." Walter's voice cracked. "I know how this sounds. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I'm asking you, begging you, to trust me anyway, just this once. Get off this stage, get out of this building, and if I'm wrong, if nothing happens, you can go back to thinking I'm a crazy old man who imagines things. But if I'm right—" The first crack was barely audible over the sound of Harrison's voice, still droning through his opening remarks. But Walter heard it. The sound of steel finally giving way, of metal that had been stressed beyond its limits finally surrendering to physics and time. It came from directly above the stage, from the exact spot where Maya would be standing in 11 minutes. "Did you hear that?" Maya's voice was suddenly sharp, alert. She looked up at the ceiling, and Walter saw the moment when her expression changed, when she stopped seeing a crazy janitor and started seeing something else. What was that sound? The beginning of the end. Walter grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the emergency exit. "We have to go. Now. Right now." But Maya didn't move toward the door. Instead, she turned toward the main hall, toward the 800 people who were sitting beneath a ceiling that was about to kill them. "We have to warn them. We have to. There's no time. They won't listen. I've been trying to warn them all morning, and no one. They'll listen to me." Maya's voice was steady, certain. The voice of someone who had spent her entire life being told she was exceptional, being trained to lead, being prepared for exactly this kind of moment. "I'm the valedictorian. I'm about to give a speech to the governor of Massachusetts. If I walk out onto that stage and tell everyone to evacuate, they'll listen." Walter wanted to argue, wanted to drag her out the door, throw her over his shoulder if necessary, do whatever it took to get her to safety. But he looked at her face, her mother's determination, his own stubbornness, and he knew she wasn't going to run. She was going to do exactly what he would have done at her age. She was going to try to save everyone. "Then let's do it together," he said. "I'll explain the technical details. You make them believe." They burst onto the stage just as Harrison was introducing the governor, creating a commotion that made every head in the hall turn toward them. Security guards started moving, pushing through the crowd, but Maya was already at the microphone, her voice ringing out across the hall with an authority that made everyone freeze. "I need everyone to listen very carefully. This building is not safe. The structural supports are failing. We need to evacuate immediately. Not in 5 minutes. Not after the ceremony. Right now. Please move calmly but quickly toward the exits." For a moment, nothing happened. 800 people sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. Then Harrison was at the microphone, pushing Maya aside, his face red with fury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. Miss Richardson appears to be experiencing some kind of episode, and we'll have medical staff attend to her immediately. Please remain seated while we—" The second crack was louder than the first, loud enough that everyone heard it, loud enough that plaster dust began to drift down from the ceiling like snow, settling on the shoulders of guests who were suddenly looking up with very different expressions on their faces. "That's the main support beam failing," Walter said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of alarm. He was at the microphone now, having shouldered past Harrison with strength that surprised them both. "In approximately 7 minutes, the ceiling of this hall is going to collapse. I know this because I designed this building 40 years ago, before my work was stolen and my career was destroyed. I've spent the last 30 years maintaining structures that were never built to proper specifications, and 2 weeks ago, every reinforcement I added was removed without my knowledge." He held up the blueprint, letting the audience see the yellowed paper, the precise lines, the signature in the corner. "My name is Walter Green. I'm not a janitor. I'm a structural engineer. And I'm telling you that if you don't leave this building in the next 5 minutes, you will die." The third crack was accompanied by a groan of metal that sent genuine fear rippling through the crowd. People began to stand, began to move toward the exits, began to realize that the old black man at the microphone might actually know what he was talking about. The evacuation started slowly, then accelerated as more cracks appeared in the ceiling, as chunks of plaster began to fall, as the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. Harrison grabbed Walter's arm, his face twisted with rage and terror. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The lawsuits alone will destroy us. The scandal—" "You knew." Walter's voice was quiet, but it cut through Harrison's bluster like a blade. "I saw it in your face this morning when I showed you the blueprint. You knew your father changed the specifications. You knew the building was compromised. And you were willing to let 800 people die to protect your family's reputation." Harrison's face went white. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the ceiling gave its final warning. A sound like the world tearing itself apart, metal and concrete and 40 years of deferred maintenance all surrendering at once. The first beam came down at the far end of the hall, crushing rows of empty chairs where guests had been sitting moments before. The second beam followed immediately, bringing a section of ceiling with it, filling the air with dust and debris. The hall erupted into chaos. People screamed, pushed, trampled each other in their desperation to reach the exits. Walter grabbed Maya and pulled her toward the stage right door, but she resisted, pointing toward a cluster of elderly guests who had fallen near the center of the hall, unable to move fast enough to escape. "We have to help them!" Walter looked at the ceiling, calculating angles and stress points with the instinct of a lifetime. The main support column, the one directly above the stage, was still holding, but barely. When it went, it would bring down the entire center section, killing anyone still inside. They had maybe 90 seconds, maybe less. "Go," he said, pushing Maya toward the door. "Get out. Now." "Not without you. I said go." Walter's voice was sharp with a father's authority, an authority he had never before had the right to claim. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Get out of this building and don't look back." Maya stared at him, and something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding, a moment of connection that transcended the chaos surrounding them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Walter looked at his daughter, the child he had given up, the woman he had watched from afar, the person he loved more than anything in the world but had never been allowed to hold, and felt the words rising in his throat. Words he had carried for 18 years. Words he had never thought he would say. But there was no time. The ceiling was coming down, and if he stood here explaining the truth, they would both die. "Because someone has to," he said. And then he turned and ran toward the center of the hall, toward the fallen guests, toward the column that was about to give way. The next 60 seconds were a blur of motion and noise and desperate calculation. Walter reached the elderly guests, 3 of them, 2 women and a man, none capable of moving quickly, and began half carrying, half dragging them toward the nearest exit. Other people joined him, forming a human chain that passed the victims toward safety. The ceiling groaned and cracked above them, raining debris with every passing second. But Walter kept moving, kept calculating, kept watching the column that was the key to everything. He got the last guest to safety with seconds to spare. The main column buckled just as Walter was turning toward the exit, its steel frame twisting and failing in slow motion, bringing tons of concrete and plaster down toward the exact spot where 800 people had been sitting moments before. Walter didn't run toward the exit. He ran toward the column. Later, witnesses would struggle to explain what they saw. An old man in a janitor's uniform, his gray hair white with plaster dust, sprinting toward the collapsing structure instead of away from it. His shoulder hitting the steel frame at the exact moment of failure, his body becoming a temporary brace that slowed the collapse by precious seconds. The impossible physics of one human being holding back the weight of a falling building through sheer force of will. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. Walter had designed that column. He knew exactly where to apply pressure, exactly how to redirect force, exactly how to buy time. He couldn't stop the collapse. No one could, but he could delay it. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. Just long enough for the last few stragglers to clear the danger zone. Just long enough for Maya, who had frozen at the exit when she saw what he was doing, to be pulled outside by security guards. The column gave way completely at the 11-second mark. Walter felt it go, felt the weight of his own creation finally overwhelming his 67-year-old body. He had one last thought as the darkness closed in. She's safe. My daughter is safe. And then there was nothing. The collapse of Harrison Hall made national news within hours. 800 people had been inside when the ceiling fell. 798 had escaped without serious injury. One elderly guest had broken her hip in the evacuation, and one man, a janitor named Walter Green, had been pulled from the rubble after 47 minutes of desperate searching, alive but critically injured. His spine damaged in 3 places, his left arm crushed beneath a steel beam that he had apparently tried to hold up with his bare hands. The story that emerged over the following days was almost too dramatic to believe. A disgraced architect who had spent 30 years working as a janitor in the building he designed. A family legacy built on theft and fraud, a cover-up that had spanned 4 decades and nearly cost hundreds of lives. News crews camped outside the hospital where Walter was being treated. Reporters dug through archives, interviewed former colleagues, reconstructed the timeline of betrayal that had led to this moment. The Harrison family's carefully constructed reputation disintegrated in a matter of hours. Principal David Harrison was arrested 3 days after the collapse, charged with reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, and obstruction of justice. Investigators had found emails on his computer proving that he had known about the structural problems for months, that he had deliberately suppressed reports, ignored warnings, and fired a facilities manager who had raised concerns. His father's records, subpoenaed from a storage facility in Connecticut, revealed the full extent of Theodore Harrison Sr.'s fraud, not just the theft of Walter's design, but systematic cost-cutting that had compromised the building from the day it was constructed. But the most explosive revelation came from the blueprint itself, the yellowed paper that Walter had carried in his pocket for 30 years. Forensic document analysts confirmed that it was authentic, dated 1984 and signed in Walter Green's own hand. More importantly, they found notes in the margins that matched Walter's handwriting from his MIT thesis, notes that Theodore Harrison could not possibly have made because they referenced structural engineering concepts that Theodore had never studied. The proof was incontrovertible. Walter Green had designed Harrison Hall, and Theodore Harrison had stolen it. Maya Richardson visited the hospital on the 4th day, when Walter was finally stable enough to receive visitors. She had spent the intervening time in a state of shock, processing not just the trauma of the collapse, but the cascade of revelations that followed. The janitor she had greeted every morning for 13 years was actually a brilliant architect whose career had been destroyed by the family her school was named after. He had risked his life to save her, had run toward a collapsing building instead of away from it, for reasons she was only beginning to understand. She found him in a private room that the hospital had arranged after the media attention made a regular ward impossible. He was lying in a bed surrounded by machines, his body wrapped in bandages and braces, his eyes closed. For a moment, Maya thought he was asleep. Then he spoke, his voice rough but clear. "You came." "Of course I came." Maya sat in the chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding with questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "You saved my life. You saved everyone's life. The least I can do is visit you in the hospital." Walter opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, without the careful distance he had maintained for 18 years. "I wasn't just saving everyone. I was saving you. Specifically you." He paused, gathering strength. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid I'd ruin your life the way I ruined my own." Maya's breath caught. Some part of her had known, she realized, had sensed it in the way he looked at her, the way he said her name, the way he had been willing to die for her without hesitation. "Tell me." Walter reached under his pillow and pulled out an envelope. Battered, worn, clearly old. "I wrote this for you, years ago. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. I don't think there's ever going to be a right moment, so—" He held it out to her. "This is the truth. All of it." Maya took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 18 years ago, the day of her birth. To my daughter, by the time you read this, I'll probably be dead. That's not pessimism, it's just statistics. Black men in America don't live as long as we should. And I've already pushed my luck further than I had any right to expect. I want you to know who you are and where you came from, because the world will try to tell you a different story. They'll tell you that you were abandoned, that your father didn't want you, that you were given away because you weren't worth keeping. None of that is true. Your mother's name is Angela. She was the love of my life, brilliant, beautiful, the kind of woman who made me want to be a better man. When she got pregnant with you, I was already broken. My career had been destroyed, my reputation was in ruins, and I had nothing to offer either of you except failure and shame. So I pushed her away. I said terrible things. I made her believe that I didn't want you, because I thought that was the only way to set her free. It was the worst mistake I ever made. Worse than trusting Theodore Harrison. Worse than anything. I spent months trying to find her after you were born, trying to apologize, trying to explain. By the time I tracked her down, she had already arranged for your adoption. She was too sick to care for you herself, and she wanted you to have the life I couldn't provide. The life you deserved. I could have fought for custody, could have demanded my rights as your father. But I looked at my life, the destroyed career, the empty apartment, the future that stretched ahead with nothing but minimum wage and regret, and I realized that fighting for you would be selfish. The Richardsons could give you everything. I could give you nothing. So I stayed away. I watched from a distance. I took a job at your school so I could see you grow up, so I could be there if you ever needed me, so I could feel like a father even if I could never act like one. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was all I had. I don't know what kind of woman you'll be when you read this. I don't know if you'll hate me for my choices or understand them. I just want you to know that you were never unwanted. You were never abandoned. You were loved, desperately, completely, from the moment you were born, by a father who was too broken to show it and too proud to admit it. My name is Walter Green. I was an architect once, before the world taught me that black men don't get to dream that big. Now I'm a janitor who watches his daughter from across a hallway, too afraid to say hello, too grateful for every glimpse to walk away. Whatever you become, wherever you go, whoever you choose to be, know that I'm proud of you. Know that I've always been proud of you. And know that if there's any justice in this universe, someday I'll find the courage to tell you all of this in person. Until then, I remain what I've always been, your father, in the only way I knew how to be. Walter Maya was crying before she finished the first paragraph. By the end, she was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, clutching the letter to her chest like it was the most precious thing she had ever held. 18 years of questions. 18 years of wondering why she was different, why she felt drawn to architecture magazines and engineering documentaries, why she had always felt a strange connection to the old janitor who smiled at her every morning. It all made sense now. It all finally, heartbreakingly, made sense. "I'm sorry," Walter said, his own tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm sorry." Maya leaned forward and took his hand, gently, carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Don't apologize. Don't you dare apologize." Her voice was fierce despite the tears. "You saved my life. You spent 30 years protecting a building full of people who didn't even know your name. You sacrificed everything, your career, your pride, your whole future, so that I could have opportunities you were never given." She squeezed his hand tighter. "That's not something to apologize for, that's something to be proud of." Walter looked at her, this brilliant, compassionate, extraordinary young woman who had somehow emerged from his failure and become everything he had dreamed she could be, and felt something shift inside him. The wall he had built around his heart, the protective shell of distance and denial that had kept him functioning for 18 years, began to crack. And behind it was joy. Pure, overwhelming, impossible joy. "I have so many questions," Maya said. "About you, About my mother? About everything. I want to know all of it. Every story, every memory, every detail you've been saving up for 18 years. I'll tell you everything, Walter promised. As much as you want, for as long as you want. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask. Maya smiled through her tears. Her mother's smile, Walter thought, but also his smile, the smile he used to have before the world beat it out of him. Then let's start now. We have a lot of time to make up for. The recovery took months. Walter's spine had been damaged too severely to ever fully heal. He would walk again, but with difficulty, relying on a cane and frequent rest. His left arm had limited mobility, the result of nerve damage from the crushing weight he had borne during those impossible 11 seconds. But he was alive, and for the first time in 40 years, he had a reason to be grateful for that. Maya visited every day. She brought books, meals, questions that stretched for hours as Walter unpacked the story of his life. She contacted Angela, who was living in Seattle and had spent 18 years regretting the choices she'd been forced to make. The reunion between Walter and Angela was complicated. Too much pain, too many lost years, too much that could never be recovered. But they found a way to be in each other's lives again, to give Maya the family she had always wanted. The Westbrook Academy Board voted unanimously to rename Harrison Hall. The new name, proposed by the student body and approved by acclamation, was Walter Green Memorial Hall, though Walter had pointed out, with his characteristic dry humor, that he wasn't actually dead yet, and perhaps they should wait before making it a memorial. The board had laughed, the first genuine laughter the institution had known since the collapse, and amended the name to simply Green Hall. The dedication ceremony happened 8 months after the collapse, on a spring day when the azaleas were in bloom and the new construction had finally been completed. The building had been redesigned from the ground up, this time by a diverse team of architects that included 2 black women and a Latino man. Talents who would never have been given the opportunity 40 years ago, but who were now leading the profession into a more equitable future. Walter sat in the front row, his cane resting against his chair, Maya on one side and Angela on the other. He was wearing a suit for the first time in 4 decades, a gift from Maya, who had insisted that the man whose building was being dedicated should look the part. The governor of Massachusetts gave the keynote address, praising Walter's courage and lamenting the injustice that had kept his contributions hidden for so long. Universities announced scholarships in his name. Architecture firms offered partnerships and consulting positions. The MIT president personally apologized for the institution's failure to support Walter during his original ordeal and announced a new fellowship for underrepresented minorities in structural engineering. Walter listened to all of it with a strange sense of detachment. The recognition was nice, better late than never, as the saying went, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the young woman sitting beside him, holding his hand, looking at him with the pride and love he had spent 18 years dreaming about. What mattered was the building rising behind him, finally constructed to the specifications he had originally designed, finally safe for the generations of students who would pass through it. What mattered was the truth, finally told, finally believed, finally given the weight it deserved. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he walked slowly to the podium, leaning on his cane but refusing assistance. The audience, a mix of dignitaries, journalists, community members, and students, fell silent as he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the faces before him. 40 years ago, he began, I was a young architect with a dream. I wanted to build things that would last, things that would stand for generations, sheltering people, protecting people, giving them spaces to learn and grow and become who they were meant to be. He paused, looking at the building behind him. That dream was stolen from me. My work was taken. My name was erased. And I spent 3 decades mopping floors in the building I designed, watching other people take credit for my vision, unable to prove the truth. He turned back to the audience. I'm not here to complain about that. I'm not here to seek revenge or demand apologies from people who are long dead. I'm here to tell you what I learned during those 30 years in the shadows." His voice grew stronger, carrying across the crowd with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "I learned that the people who clean your buildings know more about them than the people who own them. I learned that the ones you overlook are often the ones holding everything together. I learned that you can spend your whole life being invisible, being dismissed, being told that your voice doesn't matter, and still find ways to make a difference." He looked at Maya and his voice softened. "I also learned that the most important things can't be built with steel and concrete. They have to be built with love, with patience, with the courage to tell the truth even when no one wants to hear it. I spent 18 years watching my daughter from across a hallway, too afraid to tell her who I was. That was a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. Bigger than trusting the wrong partner. Bigger than losing my career, bigger than anything." He straightened, despite the pain in his back, despite the effort it cost him. "So, here's what I want to say to anyone who's listening. Don't wait. Don't hide. Don't let fear convince you that your voice doesn't matter or your truth doesn't deserve to be told. The world will try to silence you. The world will tell you that you're not important enough, not credentialed enough, not the right color or gender or class to be heard. Don't believe it. Speak anyway. Fight anyway. Because the people who built the systems that silence us are counting on our compliance. They're counting on us staying quiet, staying invisible, staying in the shadows where they put us." He raised his cane, pointing at the building behind him. "I designed this hall 40 years ago. It was stolen from me, cheapened, nearly turned into a death trap by people who valued profit over safety. But I didn't give up. I didn't walk away. I spent 30 years keeping it standing with my own hands, my own money, my own stubborn refusal to let injustice have the final word." His voice rang out across the crowd, carrying the weight of 4 decades of silence finally broken. "They ignored my warnings because I was a janitor, because I was old, because I was black. They assumed that someone who cleans toilets couldn't possibly understand structural engineering. They were wrong. And their mistake almost killed 800 people." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Don't make that mistake. Don't assume that the people you overlook have nothing to teach you. Don't dismiss voices just because they come from unexpected places. The janitor might be an architect. The waitress might be a genius. The homeless man on the corner might have a story that would break your heart and change your life." He looked out at the audience one final time. At the journalists and dignitaries, at the students who would walk through these halls for generations to come, at his daughter and her mother and the family he had finally found. "My name is Walter Green. I was an architect. I became a janitor. And I am living proof that it is never too late to tell your story, claim your truth, and build something that lasts." He stepped back from the podium, and the applause that followed was not the polite acknowledgement of a formal speech. It was something deeper, a roar of recognition, of respect, of collective shame for a world that had kept this man hidden for so long. People were crying. People were standing. People were looking at the janitors and cleaners and service workers in the crowd with new eyes, wondering what stories they carried, what truths they held, what expertise had been dismissed and denied. Maya reached him first, wrapping her arms around him as gently as she could, mindful of his injuries but unable to contain her emotion. "That was incredible," she whispered. "You were incredible." Walter held his daughter, really held her, for only the second time in her life, and felt the last of his walls crumble. "No," he said softly. "You're incredible. You're everything I ever dreamed you would be. And getting to watch you become that, even from the shadows, even from a distance, was the greatest privilege of my life." They stood there together, father and daughter, architect and valedictorian, 2 people whose lives had been shaped by injustice but refused to be defined by it. Behind them, Green Hall rose into the Boston sky, its steel frame gleaming in the afternoon sun, its foundations finally secure. built by Walter Green in 1984, saved by Walter Green in 2024, standing as a testament to the truth that the people we overlook are often the ones who hold everything together. And on a small plaque near the main entrance, installed at Maya's request, were the words that would greet every student who passed through those doors for generations to come. They ignored the janitor's warning. He saved them anyway. True strength lies not in the recognition we receive, but in the work we do when no one is watching. Walter Green, Architect.